For some reason, the book of Hebrews is not very popular among preachers, and I've not heard many sermons on it. So I thought I'd start by telling you a bit about the context of our reading. The book's full name is the Epistle to the Hebrews. Epistle means letter, so we know it's a letter. Unfortunately, the first chapter of this letter is missing the salutation section that says who wrote it and whom they wrote it to. Paul, for example, begins his letters with his name and then writes something like, "To the Church of God in Corinth." Hebrews is not signed by name. So we only have the title, "To the Hebrews." And from that and the content, we can deduce that the letter is meant to be read by first century Jewish Christians in particular. But who wrote it? Traditionally, it was thought to be Paul, because after all, he wrote most of the letters in the New Testament. But again, Paul always signs his letters. And moreover, it's written in a quite different style than Paul. A more recent theory is that the letter's author might have been Priscilla, an early Christian missionary who's mentioned 6 times in 4 different New Testament books. If it was Priscilla, that could explain why the letter is unsigned. It's unsigned to protect it from being questioned for having a woman author. In any case, even without certainty about the author, the letter has been preserved by the church, which is great because it gives us some challenging and also, I think, beautiful passages. I'll go through our reading verse by verse, so if you have the chance to have your program handy or have a Bible or app to look at it. This morning's text is from Hebrews chapter 11. There are 10 chapters of the letter before this, and they give you a careful argument about who is Jesus and do we have to obey the law. The conclusion of the letter up to this point is that Jesus is the perfect high priest and has made for all time the only sacrifice needed. Thanks to Jesus, we can enter the sanctuary and approach God with confidence. Hebrews 10, verse 22, which is not in our reading, but before it, puts it this way. Since we have Jesus, quote, "Let us approach with a true heart and assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water." I personally think that's quite beautiful, the metaphor of baptism, making our hearts true and clean and pure, regardless of their state before. That verse sets up our reading today. Hebrews 10 tells us we can approach God with assurance of faith, and then Hebrews 11 starts by mentioning this concept and explaining what is faith. It says, confident faith is confidence in what we hope for. That seems plausible, but if you think about it, it can also be a trap. If faith means confidence, then if you have confidence, you have faith. But what if you don't? What if you lack confidence? What if you aren't hopeful? What if you aren't certain about things you can't see or a future you don't believe in? Does that mean you don't have faith? And if so, how do you get it? How do we convince ourselves to believe more, to hope more, to have more faith? This state of feeling the need to have faith, but not believing you have enough, has ensnared a lot of Christians through the ages. It can be scary and shameful to feel this way. But remember what I just summarized from Hebrews 10. The argument there is that because of Jesus, because of what he has done, because of who he is, we can approach God with assurance of faith. The argument is because of Jesus, not us, we can approach God with assurance of faith. Thus, instead of trying in ourselves to generate the required level of confidence for faith, whatever that is, we can just focus on Jesus, who has done this for us. Hebrews 11, then, tells us how this faith is similar to that of our ancestors. Who are our ancestors? Remember, this letter is written to Jewish Christians. Thus, our ancestors refers to their predecessors, heroes of faith that first century Jews would recognize. Verse 3, then, reminds us that God created everything, a perfect segue for going back to the beginning, Genesis. Verses 4 through 7 are omitted from our reading, but they list some big names from the book of Genesis: Abel, Enoch, Noah. Then in verse 8, we get to Abraham. Abraham's kind of a big deal for Jews, Christians, and later Muslims, and so we get a whole paragraph discussing him. The key thing about Abraham is that God called him to leave his homeland, and he got up and left without even knowing where he was going. According to Genesis, Abraham walked from Ur, a city on the Persian Gulf, to Canaan by the Jordan River. Then he discovered there was a famine and moved on to Egypt for a while before coming back and settling in Hebron, which is now found in the West Bank of Palestine. The total kilometers he traveled on his journey, over 3,000, approximately the distance from Toronto to Vancouver. It's a big move. Moreover, Abraham didn't show up in Palestine and buy a nice home. As verse 9 points out, he spent his entire life in tents, like a stranger or a foreigner. The only land he will eventually buy is a burial plot for his wife. The rest of Abraham's existence is transient and impermanent, like a sojourner or like a refugee. Genesis says that Abraham chose this life because God promised him inheritance, a new homeland, and a family, despite not having had any children yet. And verse 11 highlights this. Through faith, the couple had children, and their children had children, and on, creating countless people. But if you read Genesis and Hebrews together, or you're familiar with the overall shape of the Old Testament, you may notice a discrepancy here. The story of Abraham in Genesis is also a story of how God promised him not only descendants, but a homeland. Genesis 15 describes the borders of the promised land, how much space it's supposed to occupy. And God says that this land, this promised land, belongs to Abraham's descendants. And the rest of the Hebrew Bible tells us how God's people struggle to conquer this land and then set up a kingdom, and then they themselves are conquered and taken into exile. Hebrews, however, says something a little different. Verse 10 of our passage says, Abraham looked forward to the city whose architect and builder is God. Okay, the emphasis is on a city rather than a land. No big deal. But look at the end of our reading. They desire a better homeland, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, God has prepared a city for them. In other words, Hebrews says that these heroes of faith, the ancestors of God's people, who lived by faith as strangers on the earth, the home they were seeking is not an earthly country, but a spiritual city. You may be thinking, that's interesting. It's kind of a subtle point in a big argument. So what? How does it affect us today? I think there's two questions here. One for groups and one for us personally as individuals. The group question is, do the people of God have a homeland? And what does it look like? Where is it? Many European Christians came to North America. They saw it as a promised land. that would save them from persecution and poverty. Of course, there were already people here, and the colonists used religious language to justify taking the land from them by force. This is the idea of the doctrine of discovery, which was used to justify the taking of the land of Canada and America from the Indigenous people. Because it was the promised land, as some Puritans, preachers, and others talked about it, they reinforced that idea that this land is ours. Sadly, though, the practice of forcibly expelling and killing people to get our homeland continues to this day around the world. You only need to read the news to see that. Our reading challenges this. Hebrews says the people of God are searching for a home, and they have one, but it is a city built by God in a heavenly homeland, not an earthly country with borders you can see on the map. The desire for a homeland is natural, but it cannot be fulfilled here because the faithful are strangers and foreigners on the earth. The personal question is more poignant. Do I get a home? Do you? Some Christians throughout the centuries have been inspired to give up all their worldly possessions and live a nomadic existence. I don't think that's required, and you may be glad about that. I am. Personally, I think all human beings deserve to have a safe, secure, comfortable place to live, and everyone should get to feel at home. And yet, even when you are at home, in comfort with those you love, it's possible to feel discontent, wistful, even homesick. It's a strange feeling, isn't it? That feeling doesn't necessarily mean there's something wrong with your life, that you've made a mistake, that if only everything was different, you'd finally feel at home. I wonder if it cannot be just a reminder that we were meant for something more. This discontent, perhaps, points us towards something we do not see, and we have only the assurance of faith must exist. The city of God, our true and ultimate home, a place where that feeling of homesickness will end. And until then, that discontent does not mean there's something wrong with us or wrong with our state. It may just be a tug towards something higher, something greater than what we see here now. Amen.